The document arrived in an envelope that was addressed to James Brown personally, with no return address and no covering note, just the document itself, folded once, with the kind of care that someone takes when they want the contents to arrive intact and want nothing about the delivery to be traceable back to the person who sent it. James Brown's personal assistant opened it on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1971, read the first paragraph, and immediately went to find James. She did not stop to read the rest of it. The first paragraph was enough to understand that this was something James needed to see as quickly as possible, and that deciding what happened next was not a decision she was going to make for him. James Brown read the document standing up. He read it twice. He set it on the table. He picked it up again and read it a third time, the way people read things when the content is clear, and the rereading is not about comprehension, but about the specific, reluctant process of accepting that what you are reading is real. The document was a draft, a proposal, a detailed, professionally formatted proposal that had been submitted under the name of the man James Brown had been closer to than anyone in his professional life, to a major entertainment conglomerate that was in the process of establishing a new record label. The proposal argued with considerable specificity and insider knowledge that James Brown's commercial power was in decline, that the combination of changing musical tastes, the emerging dominance of new artists, and what the proposal described as James Brown's increasingly difficult management style had made him a commercial risk rather than a commercial asset. It proposed the competing artist, a younger artist, managed by the person who had written the proposal, as the preferred investment for the new label. It used proprietary information about James Brown's business operations to support its argument, information that could only have come from someone inside the organization, someone who knew James Brown's finances, his touring schedules, his label relationships, his ongoing negotiations with radio stations and venue operators, someone James Brown trusted completely. The man's name was Earl Simmons. He had been part of James Brown's professional world since 1964, 7 years of daily proximity, of shared road miles and late nights, and the particular intimacy that develops between two people who have been through the specific crucible of touring American music venues together for nearly a decade. He was not a musician. He was not a manager in any official capacity. He occupied the harder-to-categorize role that certain people occupy in the orbits of significant artists: the confidant, the problem solver, the person who knows everything and whose judgment is sought precisely because they have no agenda of their own and no stake in the decisions they are consulted on beyond the well-being of the person they advise. The people who fill that role are rare. Most people who are close to power want something from it, and that wanting shapes every interaction in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not, but that are always present, always operating underneath the surface of even the most apparently disinterested advice. James Brown had encountered enough of those people across the years of his career to have developed a finely calibrated ability to detect the wanting, to sense, in the specific texture of how advice was given and what it recommended, whether the advisor had his interests at the center or their own. Earl Simmons had passed that test repeatedly, over 7 years, in circumstances that would have revealed self-interest if self-interest had been there to reveal. He had advised James against decisions that would have benefited him personally. He had told James truths that James had not wanted to hear, in contexts where a less honest advisor would have said what James wanted to hear and collected the goodwill. He had been in rooms where information about James's finances and operations and vulnerabilities had been discussable, and he had kept everything he heard in those rooms exactly where it belonged, inside the relationship that had made the hearing possible. That was what James Brown had believed about Earl Simmons for 7 years. The document said that the belief had been accurate for 6 of those years, and that somewhere in the 7th, something had changed. That was the specific quality of trust he had invested in a relationship that had survived touring and disputes and the various strains that the music business applies to every human connection inside it. Earl had no agenda. Earl had no stake. The document on the table said otherwise. To understand what it meant for James Brown to hold that document in his hands, you have to understand what 1971 looked like from the inside of James Brown's professional life. Not the mythology, not the hardest working man in show business, the godfather of soul, the commercial juggernaut. The actual inside, the complicated, pressured, perpetually uncertain inside of a man who was, by any external measure, at the apex of his career, and who was, by the internal measure that only he had access to, navigating something considerably more fragile than the external view suggested. The early 1970s were a period of transition in American popular music that James Brown was acutely aware of. He had not reached the top of his profession by being unable to read where things were going. He had gotten there by being ahead of the curve consistently enough that the curve eventually arrived at where he already was, which is a different relationship to cultural momentum than most artists develop and a more useful one. But being ahead of the curve is not a permanent condition. It is a position that requires constant re-earning, and James knew this with the same certainty that he knew everything about his professional life. Directly, bodily, without the buffer of self-deception that protects less clear-eyed people from uncomfortable truths about their position. He had spoken to Earl about this. He had spoken to Earl about the specific fear, the fear that the moment he had always known was theoretically possible, the moment when the music he was making stopped being what the culture needed to hear, might be arriving or might already have arrived. He had spoken to Earl about the uncertainty of what came next, about whether the path he was on was going to continue to produce the results it had produced for 15 years or whether he was approaching a turn that he could not yet see clearly. He had spoken to Earl about these things because Earl was the person he spoke to about things he could not speak to anyone else about, because speaking to anyone else about them would have changed the way those people saw him. And the way those people saw him was a professional asset he was not prepared to compromise. He had trusted Earl with his doubts. The document had used those doubts as evidence. He had built his career on a specific and innovative sound, a sound that had defined a genre, that had influenced artists across the entire spectrum of popular music, that had produced record sales and concert revenues that the industry could not ignore. But innovation, once it has been absorbed by the culture, becomes convention, and convention in the music industry is what gets replaced. James had watched this happen to artists he respected, had watched the moment when the thing that made someone original became the thing that made them familiar, had understood, from the inside, how quickly the industry's attention moved from people it had celebrated to people it was discovering. He was not unaware that the same process was available to him. Earl Simmons was aware of it too. He had watched James navigate the transition from rising star to established institution, had seen the pressures that came with each phase, and had been throughout the person James talked to about things he did not talk to anyone else about. James had told Earl things about his fears and his uncertainties that he had told no one else. He had told Earl because he trusted Earl, and because trust was not something James Brown gave easily or withdrawn without evidence. The document was the evidence. It used what James had told Earl in confidence, the specific vulnerabilities, the genuine concerns about where his music was going, and whether it would continue to find the audience it needed, to construct an argument for replacing him. It had taken the private words of a man who had trusted his closest friend and assembled them into a commercial pitch for a competing investment. James Brown put the document down. He went to the window. He stood at the window for approximately 10 minutes by his assistant's later account. 10 minutes of looking at whatever was visible through the glass, which was not the point, because the view was not what he was looking at. He was processing. He was doing the specific internal work of a man who has just been given proof of something he would have preferred not to know, and who must now decide what to do with the knowing. His assistant, who had been in the room during those 10 minutes and who knew better than to fill them with words, waited. She had worked for James long enough to understand that the conclusions he reached in silence were generally more reliable than anything that could be produced by rushing him toward them. After 10 minutes, James Brown turned from the window. He asked his assistant to get Earl Simmons on the phone. Not to come to the office, on the phone. He told her nothing else, and she called, and Earl picked up, and James Brown took the receiver. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. James Brown's assistant heard his side of it, which was limited. He said Earl's name at the beginning to establish that the connection had been made. He said, after a pause, "I have the proposal," and then he listened. For 8 of the 11 minutes he listened. Earl's voice was audible across the room in the way that voices become audible when the person speaking them is explaining something at length and under pressure. Not the words, but the cadence and the volume, the specific acoustic quality of speech that is trying to do something while the speech is happening. James Brown listened for 8 minutes. Then he said 4 sentences. He said, "I've read it. I know what it says. I know where the information came from, and I need you to listen to me carefully right now." He said, "What you put in that document about where I am commercially, you might be right, you might not be. But the information you used to make the argument, the things I told you because I trusted you, that belongs to me, not to a proposal, not to a record label, to me." He said, "You're not going to work with that artist. You're going to tell the label you're withdrawing the proposal. I'm not going to tell you how to explain it, and I'm not going to be involved in that conversation." And then he said the thing that nobody expected. Nobody who knew James Brown's history with betrayal, his meticulous financial self-protection, his code of absolute professional accountability, the way he had responded to every previous instance of someone using access to his world for purposes he had not sanctioned. Nobody who knew any of that expected what he said at the end of those 4 sentences. He said, "After that, if you want to come back and work, come back. I'm not going to bring this up again." Earl Simmons was quiet on the other end of the phone for long enough that James Brown's assistant, watching from across the room, thought for a moment that the call had been disconnected. Then Earl said something, 1 word. He said, "Why?" James Brown said, "Because of 7 years. Not because you deserve it, because of 7 years. Then he ended the call. The assistant stood in the room with the silence that followed for several seconds before James Brown looked at her. He said, "Get me coffee." Then he sat down at his desk and picked up the morning's correspondence, as if the previous 15 minutes had been a routine call from a vendor, a logistics problem that had been solved and was now behind them. He did not speak about it again that day. He did not speak about it the next day. The document was placed in a file that the assistant maintained for sensitive materials. And as far as anyone in the immediate organization was concerned, the file stayed closed. The incident produced no visible change in James Brown's schedule, his professional output, or his conduct with the people around him. He had a show that weekend. He performed it at full intensity. He had recording sessions the following week. He ran them with the precision and the demands that his engineers and musicians had come to expect, and that had never, in anyone's experience, been modulated by whatever was happening in his personal life. What the assistant noticed, because she noticed things, it was the most important skill her job required, was something she described, years later, as a shift in the quality of his silence. Not the amount of it. James Brown had always been a man who moved between speech and silence with the same purpose he brought to everything. But for several weeks after that Tuesday morning, the silence had a different texture, a more interior quality. The silence of someone who was working something out, turning it over, holding it in various positions to see what it looked like from each angle. She recognized, without being told, that he was deciding. Not about Earl. That decision had been made in 10 minutes at the window and executed in 4 sentences on the phone, and was not, in James Brown's architecture of decision-making, subject to revision. He was deciding something larger, something about what kind of person he was going to be going forward, in a world that had just demonstrated again that trust was not a guaranteed investment, and that the people you had trusted most completely were the people with the most material to damage you with if they chose to use it. Earl Simmons was quiet on the other end of the phone for long enough that James Brown's assistant thought the call had disconnected. The people who eventually learned what had happened, the small number of people close enough to James to know any version of the story, most of whom learned it through his assistant in the years after James's death, reacted without exception with some form of the same question. Why? Why would a man who had just been given documented proof that his closest friend had taken the private contents of his confidences and used them to build a commercial case against him respond by offering to let that friend come back? The answers that James Brown himself gave, when he gave any, which was rarely, and only to his assistant, in conversations she did not repeat while he was alive, were not simple. He did not explain it as forgiveness in any religious or sentimental sense. He did not claim that what Earl had done was acceptable, or that the damage was minor, or that the trust had been restored by Earl's apparent remorse. He was not naive about any of those things. What he said, in the most direct version his assistant preserved, was that there were 2 things operating simultaneously that he was not willing to sacrifice either of. One was the truth of what Earl had done, which was a genuine betrayal that had used the most private material of their friendship as a commercial instrument. The other was the truth of 7 years of genuine companionship, of real history, of the specific and irreplaceable accumulation of shared experience that is what friendship actually is, beneath everything that gets done with it or to it. He said, "You can't throw 7 years away over a bad decision, even a bad decision that bad. And you can't pretend the decision didn't happen. You hold both things. That's the only honest response." Earl Simmons withdrew the proposal. He came back. He worked for James Brown for 4 more years. He never discussed the incident with anyone, and James Brown never brought it up again, as he had said he would not. And the 4 years that followed were, by the accounts of people who observed them, not different in any visible way from the 7 that preceded the document. What was different was invisible. It was the specific quality of a trust that has been tested at its maximum point, and has survived not because the test produced no damage, but because the person who was damaged decided that the survival was worth more than the satisfaction of the alternative. James Brown had every instrument available to him to destroy Earl Simmons professionally. He had the document. He had the relationships in the industry that would have made the destruction efficient and permanent. He had the justified grievance of a man who had been genuinely wronged in the most personal possible way. He chose not to use any of them. Not because he was weak, not because he had failed to understand the magnitude of what had been done, because he had thought about it for 10 minutes at a window and had concluded that the person who came out of the destruction was not a version of himself he wanted to be. That maintaining his own integrity in the response mattered more than any accounting he could extract from Earl. That the way you treat the people who betray you says something about you that the betrayal itself does not. He was James Brown. He had built everything he had built in a world that had offered him, at almost every point, the option to become something harder and more guarded than he was. He had considered that option and declined it, repeatedly, over a career that required the declining to be repeated regularly because the world kept offering. He declined it again on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1971, with a document on a table in front of him and his closest friend on the other end of a phone. 4 sentences, 1 offer, 7 years honored. and a man who had every right to destroy someone, choosing instead to define himself by how he carried what had been done to him, carrying it fully, without pretending it wasn't there, and without letting it take from him the thing it had tried most to take. His capacity to trust, to extend, to believe that the history of a relationship is not canceled by its worst moment, even when the worst moment is very bad indeed. If this story made you think about what it costs to hold both the betrayal and the history at the same time, share it with someone today. And tell us in the comments, have you ever chosen to keep someone in your life after they hurt you in a way that would have justified letting them go? What made you decide? We read every single one.